Year 1947. Fire! Pipisha guns rattled, the machine gun spewed lead, vomiting a deadly swarm of bullets through the dense green forest, tearing and shredding everything in its path. Explosions from grenades echoed, and then the familiar dry crackle of German submachine guns and isolated pistol shots joined the deadly chorus. Major Tokayev clicked his stopwatch as the last shot faded and the echo subsided. 3.5 minutes. That's how long it took them to eliminate the forest bandits' hideout. Line the bodies up for identification. Comrade, bring the camera here. We need photos, documentation. Quickly, get to work. People moved across the battleground, dragging corpses by the legs to a small clearing. Tokayev walked around the camouflaged camp, peeking into the dugout. The smell of gunpowder and burning still hung in the air, mingling with the scent of hot lead and human hair. He shook his head, reached into his pocket for his snuff box, and took a pinch of the life-saving black powder. Ever since they'd entered that camp in southern Poland, he couldn't shake the persistent smell from his nostrils. He knew it was an illusion, he was sure of it. And yet, everywhere, always, he constantly smelled the stench of charred flesh and burning hair.
Comrade Major, just look.
He stepped over the body of a young girl and glanced at a mustached man with a hole in his head. The face looked familiar, but when one had seen so many dead people. He moved closer to what the young lieutenant was showing him. Around one bandit's neck hung a necklace, a strange, unusual necklace. Tokayev leaned in closer, unsure of what he was seeing. Then, suddenly recoiling, he covered his mouth with his hand.
Nice, isn't it, Comrade Major?
The lieutenant seemed unfazed. A sizable collection. These must be the ones the local militia reported about. My good go, the major almost said, but caught himself, clearing his throat.
At least 30 pieces, Comrade Major. Judging by the size, some are children's, too.
They had been tracking this gang for months. Their path through the forest was marked by massacres and atrocities, burned villages, and soldiers brutally slain. Even the locals said those weren't people, but phantoms emerging from the forest at night to haunt the living. The major didn't believe such nonsense. He'd survived for years of the Great Patriotic War, he knew what it could do to people. He knew what it had done to him. Take detailed photos, Tokayev ordered. Close-ups. And don't dare to think that. He broke off suddenly, looking at the dead bandit. Not at the necklace made of severed ears, but at his face. A face he'd seen before, years ago. He shook his head as if in disbelief. He kneeled beside the body, then brushed aside a lock of hair from the corpse's forehead. Matvienko, he shouted. Matvienko, to me. His adjutant ran over, his heels digging into the moss. Matvienko, have a look at him, Tokayev pointed. And tell me if he doesn't remind you of someone. The adjutant shrugged and leaned over the body, glancing questioningly at his superior. But, Comrade Major, but it is. Tokayev wasn't listening, though. He moved to the grim-faced man with the mustache. If it weren't for the cap. Fighting off a shiver, he walked along the line of corpses, pausing over one, then crouching by another, judging by the look, descending from faraway Caucasus. Yes, those are these faces. He gestured for the adjutant to join him, showed him. The adjutant spread his hands, and was about to speak, but the major gestured silence. He grabbed his arm and pulled him deeper into the forest, muttering instructions along the way. The soldiers watched them without understanding. They waited. One of them took out and lit a twist of cheap tobacco, a few others sat by a pot where porridge still simmered. Two of them cast sideways glances at the distant commander, glancing back at the empty dugout and the cooling body of the young girl beside it, would they manage or not? Finally, one waved dismissively, muttering something under his breath, and his companion laughed hoarsely. A corporal, curious, pulled a Cossack shashka from the dead bandit's sheath, swinging it through the air, testing the razor-sharp blade. A few privates discreetly rummaged through the pockets and pouches of the fallen, searching for valuables. Eventually, it seemed the commanders had reached a decision. Matvienko saluted and returned to the waiting soldiers, approached the lead officer, and issued orders. The major stood at a distance, with his back to them. Judging by the quick movements of his right hand, he was likely taking a swig from the flask he kept in his coat pocket. As the soldiers threw the bodies into the dugout, tearing down the roof and covering it with soil, several designated men dragged 4 bodies pointed out by the captain to the center of the clearing. They arranged them on a raised platform of logs, surrounding them with fresh, resinous pine branches. They drained fuel from the motorcycles, thoroughly doused the pyre, and set it alight. Before this, Matviyenko had taken a small axe from one of them, cut for stakes, and, with a stony face, drove one through each corpse's heart. Major did not tell his adjutant everything, but Matviyenko guessed the rest. Tokayev watched now remote column of the grey-black smoke and, moving his lips soundlessly, prayed. Just like his grandma taught him in his youth, with those words exactly for which his father used to give him a thrashing. He prayed as he knew that the reason cannot explain the presence of those people here, in these forests, after all these years. Present times. A tall, slender brunette with a flawless Russian accent carried a faint scent of citrus verbena. He politely asked the comrade general not to get up and placed a business card on the small table in front of him, bearing the logo of a popular Moscow weekly. Tokayev, with a trembling hand, raised the card closer to his eyes, struggling to decipher the name. "So, you're the ones writing history now," he commented, looking at the young journalist.
Thank you for agreeing to see me, Comrade General. It's a true honor to speak personally with someone so distinguished in service to our fatherland.
Tokayev grimaced internally at this misuse of terminology. This brat couldn't have been more than 25, so he had never even brushed against comrades or the fatherland, his fatherland, even as a child in a stroller. Outwardly, he just smiled. "You were recommended by people who, as they used to say in my time, weren't nobodies. So, what is it you'd like to discuss with me, young man?" The journalist swiped something and seemed to press on his phone screen, if one could press on a seamless black surface. Not even voice recorders anymore, thought the general. Everything was changing around him, his generation was slowly moving, not even away, but to the next world.
I'm interested in your academic work, Comrade General. Your archival research in the 60s has often been highlighted as truly titanic work. You published 6 volumes of monographs.
7, Tokayev corrected automatically.
7, apologies. Of course. 7 volumes of monographs exclusively on the history of Polish-Russian relations.
The general grimaced, this time without hiding it. Polish-Soviet relations. They changed it, bastards, in this new so-called revised edition. I shouldn't have agreed to let the editor. Never mind. But yes, young man, in broad terms, you're correct.
In 1965, you received the Science Award, 2nd class, and in 1972, 1st class. You were named an honorary member of the Academy of Sciences and received a doctorate in 1974. And then, if you'll forgive my frankness, you disappeared.
I'm still here, Tokayev smiled, reaching for a cookie from a silver platter. Sweets would kill him someday, he knew that, but years on the front had trained him to look death straight in the eyes.
Yes, but, General, you completely withdrew from active engagement in the academic community.
Journals, articles, lectures, they continued, yes, but your involvement faded. Young man, if you came here to tell a veteran that he hasn't done enough in his life, then forgive me, but…
Your passion faded.
The journalist interrupted.
Whatever drove you to pursue academia lost its meaning precisely in 1974. For the past 4 decades, your work has been purely a matter of inertia. You're one of the best experts of archival science still walking this earth, but it's just momentum. Like an icebreaker, still plowing through ice by sheer mass, but with its engine shut off.
For a moment, Tokayev considered throwing the brat out right then and there, but he ultimately changed his mind. He just scoffed dismissively. Icebreaker, don't even utter that word around me. That fraud, traitor, imposter Ryazunov. Everywhere I turn, I see his libels.
Do you mean Solzhenitsyn, General?
Ryazunov, Tokayev spat. Viktor Bogdanovic, by the way, that's his real name, remember that. And he was never, ever a spy. A brazen little runt trying to make a name for himself on someone else's fame. The young man evidently had a different opinion, but enough sense not to flaunt it. Tokayev, out of nerves, ate 2 more cookies, brushed the crumbs off his knees, and asked, "So, what did you want to talk about with me? But I warn you, young man, if you mention that name again."
I'll be silent as the grave.
Good, that's how it should be.
Yes, Comrade General.
He was silent for a moment, then realized the general was looking at him expectantly over the frames of thick glasses. Ah, right.
Well, I wanted to ask the general, what specifically drove you to archival work? And most importantly, what caused the sudden end of that passionate affair?
Tokayev, a bit appeased, shook his head. Ah, young man, every love in life has its beginning, usually unexpected, and an even less expected end. Are you married? The journalist raised his hand, revealing a clear mark where a ring once was.
Not anymore.
My condolences.
Divorced.
Then my sincerest congratulations. So you understand even better that something begins and something ends in life. Similarly, I had my fill of archival sciences and decided it was time to dedicate myself to something else. The journalist stared intently at Tokayev, who, pleased with himself, folded his hands over his stomach and smiled benevolently.
To what, exactly?
Excuse me, the general was surprised.
What, exactly, did you dedicate yourself to afterwards?
Well, there were various. Tokayev waved his hand vaguely. Activities. Young colleagues in the field needed advice, you understand? And then, when the USSR fell, there was a flood of material to catalogue. I served as an advisor to 3 successive presidents of the Federation, and now—
You did nothing.
The young man interrupted.
Exactly, specifically, absolutely nothing. I checked your record after 1974. Every position, every task, every role the general took on was offered to you. Some were even forced upon you. For 4 decades, forgive my bluntness, you've been watching the world pass you by. So I repeat my question, where did your passion find fulfillment?
Young man, your questions are becoming insolent again, and I won't allow this in my own home.
What did you discover? What were you searching for all these years, General?
Tokayev adjusted himself in his chair, reached out, and turned on the lamp. He always felt better when his interlocutor had to look into the light. The adversary had shown his hand, now it was Tokayev's turn to engage. What makes you assume I was searching for something?
In 48, the general was transferred to the reserves. I suppose at your own request, since you weren't promoted until 2-3 years later.
The journalist glanced at his notebook. He'd prepared well, Svolok.
From 44 to 47, you were involved in what our Western brethren called system consolidation, meaning.
Don't lecture me on terms I helped coin.
Yes, naturally. Before that, you were a member of a special NKVD unit, directly involved in establishing power structures as the front line moved away from the USSR's borders in September 39, operating in the Minsk region of Belarus until the fascist invasion in June 41.
The treacherous invasion, young man. The journalist looked at the general, surprised, but wrote something down in his little notebook.
So, General, you have been a scholarly type. You led Red Army soldiers into battle, tracked and eliminated reactionary bands in western Belarus and Ukraine, and fought forest terrorists after the war. Then suddenly, you led one final, exemplary operation and withdrew from active service. What happened?
Tokayev said nothing. Finally, he sighed heavily and asked, "How do you know about this, young man?" I won't deny it, but this information is still marked with a classified sign.
As the general himself observed, I was recommended by people who aren't nobodies.
The old man nodded. So you've seen the photos. What is it then that you don't know yet? The cruelty of war had left its mark. I felt it was time to, as we say, tie things off. To end it.
Forgive me, General, but now I'm the one feeling offended. I'm afraid our conversation ends here and now. Goodbye, General.
Stunned, Tokayev watched as the young man turned off the recording on his phone, gathered his notes from the table, and began packing everything into his leather briefcase. Blinking, Tokayev waved his hand. Young man, don't you want to know how it was?
I wanted the truth, General, not smooth lies.
Goodbye. Tokayev waited until the man began to walk toward the door, then said it was about the faces of those people. I had seen them before. The journalist stopped, looked back. He waited, pondering whether to leave right away or give the general another chance. Tokayev leaned his forehead on his fingers, closed his eyes, and forced the words out through a tight throat. Dead.
General, I'm an editor for a respected popular science and cultural studies magazine. If you're trying to tell me you took up archival work because of some prophetic dream.
Tokayev pointed to the chair. Sit down, young man.
I think I'd better go.
Now, sit down. Sit, now. The young man jumped and, obediently, returned to his seat, placing his briefcase on his lap. Tokayev smiled as he lifted his cup to his lips. He hadn't lost his touch yet. Yes, with such intellectual brats, one had to be brief and firm. I had seen those people before, the general repeated. 3 years prior, to be exact. They all died in the Warsaw Uprising.
Surely, General jests now?
No, I'm deadly, absolutely serious. Each one of them died in 1944 on the barricades of burning Warsaw. They locked eyes for a moment before Tokayev growled, annoyed, "Help me up. Lend a hand, boy." Leaning on the journalist's arm, he shuffled into the next room. When they entered, the young man gasped in astonishment.
But this is,
he stammered, looking around. The archive. The entire wall surface, from the very top down to the wainscoting, was covered in photographs. Large and small, framed and nestled between glass panes, black and white, brown, sepia-toned, and even a few in color. Some bore the marks of a hard history, frayed corners, discolorations, burns, and water stains, each leaving its scars. Others looked as if they'd just come out of the darkroom. You are the first person to enter here since my wife's death, Tokayev warned. So appreciate and respect my trust, or I'll shoot you like a dog. The journalist glanced nervously at the massive oak desk where a pistol lay atop the surface. He nodded. Tokayev patted him kindly on the shoulder. I'm joking. Oh, look here. And here. 2 seemingly unremarkable photos hung quietly among the mass on the wall, hidden in plain sight among the others. The journalist studied one of them, reaching for a magnifying glass from the shelf. Then he moved closer to the second photo, leaning in and staring intently at the faces captured within.
This. Is it the original?
Of course, Tokayev scoffed. Really, young man. This photo was taken barely an hour before the German assault on the barricade. The negatives miraculously survived. Take note of the second face from the left and the man standing in the background. And look at the photographer's shadow. The journalist studied the photo for a long moment before taking a risk.
This might sound silly, but does he have a tail?
A saber. The general gave him a pat on the shoulder. A saber, you see? We puzzled over that for weeks, trying to figure out what it could be. An unusual one, without quillons.
Without what?
Oh, you younglings. Without, well, parts protecting the hand. So, we have this one, he pointed, and that one, and the photographer.
And you're suggesting, General, that they look alike?
Tokayev sank heavily into his chair. Not alike. Not even identical. They are the same people, young man. The same ones you've seen in the records. By the way, how many photographs you were given access to?
All of them.
The general motioned for the journalist to help him up again. He walked over to the desk and opened the cabinet door. Inside was a safe. His guest politely turned away as Tokayev deftly spun the dials, grabbed the handles, and pulled. Damn, not quite. He reset the mechanism and tried again. Cursed, uncooperative old fingers. Finally, he opened the compartment, reaching in to pull out a battered, enamel-covered biscuit tin. He tapped the dented lid with a finger. This, young man, is worth more than the entire archive of the Scientific Institute. I'd ask you to stand, but you're already doing that. So, it will have to do. With almost reverent care, he removed the lid. Inside were several grey, unmarked envelopes, slightly soiled. One of them bore clear signs of something greasy. My first wife, may God grant her the heavenly kingdom, made a divine Solyanka, Tokayev murmured. But she never could understand that a man needs his own sanctum. Here, take a look. And try telling me they're not the same people. With his left hand, he handed over an envelope and with his right, a pair of white gloves. The journalist cautiously took a stack of photos from the brown paper, spreading them out on the table. He shuddered. One showed a burning pyre of arranged bodies. Others depicted 9 corpses lined up, then close-ups of faces, details of clothing. He set aside one, then another, a third. Tokayev watched him closely, nodding. Precisely. And that other one, I'm curious whether. Yes, exactly that. Now, do you see it? The young man held one of the photos, stepped back to the wall, and searched through the sea of images. Finally, he leaned in, comparing them. He turned, visibly shaken.
It's the same man. Even the haircut.
Yes. Note, young man, what Corporal Isayenko is holding in the photograph marked on the back as number 6V. The journalist approached the table and found the photo. He studied the Red Army soldier in the fur hat, looking quite pleased with himself.
A saber?
He whispered. Specifically, a Georgian shashka, most likely from the early 19th century, maybe even earlier, considering. Well, never mind, I won't bore you with the details. Suffice it to say, it's the same weapon that appears in the other photo collections, suggesting that.
The other collections?
Tokayev exhaled through his nose, visibly amused. Yes, sit down, young man, and I'll tell you the rest of this story. Or perhaps I should say, I'll show you how far I got in tracing its origins. He took another envelope from the box, put on a second pair of gloves, and began laying out the photos on the table one by one. These are part of the materials from the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, recovered from the General Government Archive. Note the man lying here on the sidewalk. You can't see the details, but the shape of the nose, the visible brow arch, and the shadowed eye socket suggest he could be. He trailed off. The journalist slid his hand over the table and pulled out one of the photos from the partisan camp's liquidation. Exactly. Of course, it's only speculation, but notice, young man, that this individual, I've tentatively labeled him the blonde for identification purposes, doesn't appear in any other photo from Archive 4, which is dedicated to the Warsaw events of 1944. The conclusion? He must have died before the other photos were taken. The young man swallowed, shaking his head.
How many were there, General?
I counted 4.
Tuchayev pointed to several photographs.
You've already seen the blonde. Here in the shadow, that's the Georgian. This blurry one is the noble, and this here is the scytheman.
His interlocutor leaned over the photograph. What's he holding in his hand?
It looks like a propeller blade from a down Stuka bomber. Someone once even specified the model and serial number of the aircraft, though I can't recall it at the moment.
The general waved a hand dismissively.
It was mounted on a shovel handle and sharpened. A primitive yet monstrous weapon, I assure you.
The journalist looked at the mustached, grim face, as if trying to read more from it. He does look, indeed, like a scytheman, he finally agreed. Simple facial features, hands more accustomed to a plough than a steering wheel. And that feather on his cap.
Well said. Do you recognize him from Archive 6?
My God. Tuchayev nodded solemnly.
That's exactly what I said back then, my God. Do you actually believe, or is it just a cultural code?
I'm Orthodox.
A cultural code, then. As for me, after that operation, I believed. I started to pray, went to church. It was partly why I had to leave the service. He paused, allowing the weight of what he was showing to sink in. But then the young man smiled uncertainly. General, but this could just be a coincidence. People's faces often resemble one another. True, Tuchayev conceded eagerly. Let me guess, you were the one who insisted on developing the biometric scanning program in the 90s, the one that now identifies terrorists among immigrants from the South? If only you knew, young man, how many years we've been working on it. The first trials, still on primitive machines, began in the late 70s. No way. Oh, yes. They could barely distinguish a circle from an ellipse, but that was the start. But we laid the foundation for an entire branch of telemetry, setting up several research cells dedicated to finding our missing prisoners in photographs from Manchuria. The history. Where were we? It could have been a coincidence, the journalist reminded the general. A simple resemblance, a coincidence. How can you be certain it's the same people? If some of them were killed, then logically, they couldn't have been alive again in 1947. Take the photo of the scytheman, here, this one. And hold on to your chair tightly. Tuchayev shook out a set of photos from another envelope marked with the number 3. He handed the visitor an old photo showing a group of soldiers in uniforms of an older design, posing in front of a ruined bunker or perhaps some 19th century fortress. No, the young man gasped, bringing the paper closer to his face. That's impossible.
Tuchayev smiled triumphantly.
And yet, it's real. We identified the blade he's holding as a Prussian sapper's bayonet, the so-called leaf-shaped type. The handle is from a supply cart shaft, and his cap is likely a modified German field cap. The photo is dated 1917, probably June. Want the exact location? I pinpointed it from staff maps.
But it's the same man.
Yes. I know what you're thinking. Let me guess, it's the same man, only younger. He fought in one war, then the next. He hasn't changed much because only about 20 years passed. Does that make sense? But how? How do you explain this?
He threw another photo onto the table. A scene in a trench, heads in spiked helmets. And the blonde staring directly at the camera. The same cold, piercing eyes, a slightly rakish mustache, even the same rebellious strand of hair escaping from under his helmet. Tuchayev savored the moment, watching as the journalist shifted his gaze between the photos, comparing, leaning in, pulling back. When the young man finally opened his mouth to speak, the general raised a finger.
That's not all. Now, try explaining this, and this.
2 more photos. One showed a cavalry officer, slightly swarthy, with hair slicked back and a narrow, guardless saber. The other, an execution scene, a condemned man with his eyes covered, tied to a post, as the officer commanding the firing squad raised his hand, ready to give the final command.
The first one is obvious.
Tuchayev immediately took back the cavalryman's photo.
But here, look closely, the family signet ring on the officer's hand. Compare it with the materials from Archive 4.
The journalist placed the 2 photos side by side and reached for a magnifying glass. After studying them closely, he groaned softly. The same.
The same. And I must admit, young man, back then I reacted much like you. Raised in the spirit of Marxist rationalism, I searched for an explanation, a logical answer. Because even when faced with undeniable facts, the human mind tends to ignore them, seeking some denial. Yet it's hard to argue with source materials.
Tuchayev reached for another envelope, but the journalist stopped him with a gesture. What are they?
I don't know,
Tuchayev replied simply.
Spectres of war? Ghosts returned from the grave? Or maybe they're a manifestation of the same nationalist struggle the Poles have fought through the ages. I have no doubt that somewhere, someday, someone will find an answer. But for us, right now, this is a supernatural phenomenon. Look at this.
A tiny photo was nestled between 2 pieces of armored glass, clamped with steel brackets at the corners. Without this protection, it would likely fall apart at the slightest touch. The general handed the journalist a series of computer printouts, enlargements, and reproductions of fragments he found noteworthy. He waited. It's them.
The young man looked up after a moment.
The same people. But this photo, it must be at least 150 years old.
Tuchayev nodded solemnly. 1863, a significant date for the Poles, year of their January uprising. For the rest of the world, it's the year of the opening of the London Underground, illustrating the gap in technology and mentality, or, in short, national backwardness. But that doesn't matter, because here we have something timeless. The entire group, all 4 of them, in one photo.
The journalist stared at the solemn faces, the enigmatic eyes, the closed, silent lips. The Georgian, the Scytheman, the noble, and the blonde. The same people. Unchanged by time, identical. Except,
you noticed,
the general took back the photo, studying the men standing in proud poses.
The only thing that betrays them is their eyes. The further back in time we go, the younger, more lively and hopeful they look. Human, one might say. And then, emptier, burned out. If you look at the photo from the Warsaw Uprising, you'll understand what I mean.
The journalist reached again for the photo, looking at the men by the barricade.
Do you see that machine gun, right here? Because of it, an entire platoon of insurgents died, 26 people. The cause? Spent shells inserted into the ammo belt.
The young man didn't react as expected, so Tuchayev rolled his eyes.
Did you serve in the army? No? I should have guessed. If you put a spent shell into a belt full of live rounds, the firing mechanism jams and locks up. The weapon becomes useless, understand? Those Poles died because someone sabotaged their main weapon.
Are you suggesting that?
No. But I'm presenting some undeniable facts. This photo from the First World War was taken in the area of the fiercest fighting on the Eastern Front, involving mostly people conscripted from former Polish lands annexed by neighboring empires in the 18th century. Battalions composed of men who were once neighbors, who had literally lived side by side, slaughtered each other in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The journalist looked over the photos once more, and a glimmer of understanding flashed in his eyes.
They're always fighting against us, aren't they? But surely Warsaw breaks that pattern.
Tokayev grimaced reluctantly, but nodded. A fight against Imperial Russia, yes. In every uprising, every war, every revolt. And always on the front line, always the ones doomed to fall, dragging others to slaughter with them. Don't forget, the Warsaw Uprising didn't erupt by accident. The Poles didn't want us to be the ones to liberate Warsaw. Even at historical conferences, their historians more often raise arguments about the alleged lack of support from the Red Army than the disorganization and lack of strategy in the fight itself, or the fact they faced overwhelming Nazi forces. Well, they can hold that view.
2 cases aren't enough to draw such sweeping conclusions, General. The First World War, by nature, was a time of fratricidal battles, even for us, during the Civil War.
You're sharp for your age and for these times.
So, what did you find, General, regarding that photo, the one from the 19th century?
Several photocopied documents passed across the desk. This photo was taken shortly before our troops stormed one of the insurgent redoubts. See here on the map? Tokayev pointed. Significant Polish forces were concentrated at the fork of 2 rivers in a village on a hilltop. An excellent defensive position, wouldn't you agree? The journalist examined the map and nodded hesitantly.
Yes, but the Tsarist forces had artillery, didn't they? If the insurgents were waging a guerrilla war, then attempting a defense against a regular army from a position with no chance of retreat was.
He fell silent, shaken. Suicide, Tokayev completed his thought. An act of courage, if you'd rather put it that way. Just like the uprising of 44, exactly like fighting against the Red Army. These people, young man, knew very well how their fight would end. And they went into battle regardless, or perhaps precisely because of it.
What could have driven them?
The general shrugged. I have no idea. If we accept the impossible as possible, that they truly appear in every war, every time blood is shed. Revenge? A love of carnage? Some twisted philosophy? If there's one thing I see when I look at these photos chronologically, it's pathology. A distorted love that, over time, turns into self-destructive hatred.
He beats because he loves,
the journalist scoffed. And how else would you describe Poland's history over the last century and a half? It's practically a chronicle of collective suicide by successive generations of its elites. The very people capable of raising this country up chose to die senselessly rather than live for it. Do you know the motto of the leader of the January uprising?
No, what was it?
I don't know if there's a point, I only know there's a necessity.
General, you must be joking.
I wouldn't dare. Besides, if we're talking about fratricidal struggles, take a look at this. Tokayev handed his guest a photocopy of a hand-drawn sketch. The image showed a fierce young man with a manet of blonde hair, holding a flintlock pistol extended forward.
The blonde.
The journalist identified him instantly.
What's this illustration?
It's a hand-drawn sketch of one of the assassins of Polish General Maurycy Hałka. You probably won't know those events, so I'll summarize it. In 1830, an uprising breaks out in Poland.
Yet another one. Unsuccessful, I assume?
Once again, applause for your insight. But don't interrupt me, young man, it's impolite. The uprising begins with a conspiracy at the cadet school, leading to a revolt among Warsaw's garrison, with the goal of assassinating the Tsar's viceroy, Prince Constantine. Along the way, there's a massacre of Polish generals. Yes, yes. Poles killing their own top officers. One of the first to die is Maurycy Hałka, a veteran of many wars and uprisings, a great patriot overall. Look, there's a lithograph of him on the wall. From the wall, a man with a round,
heavy face and a thick neck gazed back, a slick down curl pasted to his forehead, a blue ribbon of an order, silver epaulets, straight out of Anna Karenina, noted the journalist.
Despite appearances, an excellent commander, I assure you. I've studied his career thoroughly, Anne. Never mind. When the uprising breaks out, Hauke tries to evacuate his family from the city. He places his wife and most of his many children in a carriage. Yes, young man. Compared to them, we are mere shadows of bravery, heh. He gets his family into the carriage and, riding alongside on horseback, tries to lead them out of burning Warsaw.
How far do they get?
Not even a mile. They run into a group of insurgents marching down the street, who, seeing Hauke, greet him with shouts of "Lead us, General." Hauke, who opposed the uprising, rises in his stirrups and begins to address the armed crowd, fighting not so much for his life as for his family's. The official version says he used the word foolishness, which enraged the insurgents so much they pulled him from his horse, began beating and kicking him, and then shot him 19 times. 19 times! With black powder weapons, can you imagine that?
Massacre, the journalist shook his head, recalling the calibers of pistols from that era.
And all of it right in front of his family. However, I found testimony in our archives from the coachman, a certain Wyklęci Ligawa, who kept his head in the chaos. He whipped the horses, broke through the bloodthirsty crowd, and got the unfortunate general's family out of the city. The sketch you're holding, that's his work. Yes, indeed. Our Ligawa turned out to be a self-taught artist, and a fairly talented one at that. He was less skilled with words, so the gendarme who questioned him weeks later simply asked him to draw portraits of the assassins. The general paused, glancing around for some tea.
The long monologue had genuinely tired him, his throat beginning to resist, but at last, after so many years, he could share this with someone. The young man jumped up, ran to the parlor where the refreshments were, filled a cup, and set it dutifully on the desk. Tokayev took a sip, looking at him gratefully.
Thank you. There's one more curious detail from Ligawa's testimony. During his final, ill-fated speech, Hauke apparently recognized someone in the crowd. The coachman claims that the general was an excellent speaker, and many of those who later became his killers must have known and respected him because, as Ligawa put it, he scolded them as if they were unruly children. Those were Ligawa's exact words. But at one point, Hauke paused, leaned out of the saddle, and addressed one of the cadets directly, visibly surprised. According to the coachman's account, he said, and I quote, "Thou cannot be here, as thou died." And then, without any warning, the first shot rang out.
They both looked at the sketch of the blonde with his flintlock pistol.
I didn't get any further. I stumbled upon the document in 1972.
Tokayev leaned back in his chair, grimacing as his back flared with pain.
After another 2 years of searching, I knew there was nothing more to find.
And Hauke's campaigns? If he recognized one of his own men, then... Tokayev raised a hand, beginning to count off on his fingers.
The 1792 war with Russia. The Kosciuszko uprising. The Polish legions in Italy, where there was the Battle of Mantua and imprisonment. Campaigns of 1809 and 1813. We're talking thousands, tens of thousands of people. And any visual materials were extremely rare. It was decades before photography was even conceived. I reviewed countless paintings and portraits, but found nothing.
So the mystery remains unsolved? We'll never know where these people came from? Tokayev spread his age-spotted hands.
They may not have come from anywhere. They may have always existed, joining every new war and turmoil, and we, seeing only fragments of history, draw the wrong conclusions. Archival science, young man, isn't a closed, finite field. It gives us a glimpse, not a full view. Not everything in this world has to have a cause, some things just are.
Much like your fascination with archival science?
Young man, if after hearing this story you're still not convinced, then...
The journalist gave a sly smile. General, you worked too long for the NKVD to still not instinctively lie. But you still haven't answered my question.
Excuse me? How dare you?
The young man leaned forward in his chair, gazing at the general in a way that made Tokayev flinch. There was something in his face that had escaped his notice before. You haven't given me the reason that drove you to become interested in this story. I've heard a tale, yes, a fascinating one, but only about what you found during your search. What is in the collection with number 5? Tokayev sighed heavily, nodded, and reached deeper into the safe, pulling out yet another envelope.
You're truly a surprisingly intelligent young man, he admitted. Several decades ago, I would have recommended recruiting you into the GRU myself. But times changed. What I'm about to tell you stays within these 4 walls. Understood?
Of course, General. Besides, I forgot to turn on the recording anyway, so you can sleep soundly.
I haven't slept soundly since 47,
Tokayev growled.
I fear crowds because in any one of them, I might see one of those phantoms. Archive number 5, young man, documents what we did near Minsk in 1940.
Kuropatty, the journalist's eyes flashed. The general nodded, looking him straight in the eye.
Kuropatty. The complex had been running since 37, but we joined in with the Polish prisoners only in November of 39. Everyone talks about Kharkov, Medny, Katyn. But our little provincial Kuropatty remains unmentioned. And that's good, let it stay that way. There's nothing there to boast about.
You were just following orders, the journalist noted. Tokayev must have heard the hint of irony in his voice, but he nodded firmly.
Yes.
And was that the first time you saw them, General, in a transport of prisoners?
Not quite, young man. They weren't ordinary prisoners. They were our informants. Unofficial collaborators, understand? They supervised the barracks, reported any signs of collective dissent among the transports. They pacified rebellious sentiments when the Poles started making a fuss.
And as a reward, they were killed last? The general said nothing, his mouth tightening into a thin, white line. The journalist glanced once more at the photos, moved one closer to another, compared them, and asked, I just don't understand how you identified the noble. That signet ring is barely visible here, and it doesn't appear in any of the photos from Archive 4. Tokayev tilted the metal box, shook it, and an old signet ring engraved with a coat of arms rolled across the desk.
I took it from him, the general admitted. Pulled it off his hand while it was still warm, before they covered him with lime and earth. They were paying us a pittance at the time, and, well, it was a nice piece of silver, just a war trophy, and thanks to it, I recognized him later in the photo.
So, is it the end of this story, General? Phantoms returning during wars, finally sent to eternal rest by a brave NKVD officer. Truly a worthy conclusion to such a glorious mission. The general jolted in his chair, blinking. Those words. Words he'd heard before. But surely it couldn't be true. The journalist removed his glasses, tucking them into his pocket, and ruffled his previously slicked-back hair. He leaned closer so the nearsighted Tokayev could get a good look at his face. As you said, Comrade General, we ignore the facts, even when they stare us right in the face. He reached over, grabbed the signet from the desk, and slid it onto the ring finger of his right hand. The ring fit perfectly into the indent on his skin, as if it had always been there.
No, no, no. This is a trick, a deception, a conspiracy.
Tokayev stammered, staring at the noble now seated before him.
This is impossible, and I?
The spectre nodded, stood up, and strolled along the wall covered with photos. Yes. And you, Comrade Tokayev, along with countless others. An endless number of times, since. Oh, but of course, you don't really know how it all began, do you? Well, doesn't matter. But let me show you how it finally ends. He moved behind the general, grabbed the chair, and spun it sharply toward the television set on the cabinet. He clicked the remote, and the screen buzzed and flickered as the cable receiver powered on. All these wars, uprisings, insurrections. The noble muttered under his breath, flipping through channels. More than 2 centuries. 200 years since we allied with that French Antichrist to drown Moscow in blood. As if one tyrant could replace another, and servitude to Bonaparte was somehow better. Constantly fighting, endlessly dying for what doesn't love us back. And do you know, Comrade General, what conclusion we've reached? He leapt in front of Tokayev, gripping the armrests with fingers curled like claws. Leaning close, like a predatory bird over its prey, he hissed into the trembling old man's ear. "That Poland has not yet perished, so long as we still live." "But," the general whimpered, feeling his weakening heart flutter frantically in his chest.
"These people, your own men. Leading them to doom, to oblivion, like sheep to the slaughter. For what purpose?"
The noble straightened and stepped back, pointing to the television screen. In the corner, the logo of a Polish state TV station appeared. A press conference was just beginning, with a large crowd gathered in front of the Ministry of Defense building. Banners and red and white flags waved, civilians and uniformed soldiers stood in ordered ranks. Judging by the number of military personnel, the minister, already positioned at the podium, was about to speak. "Because if she perishes, then also we will be allowed to die." On the screen, the emotional reporter babbled on in Polish as a man approached the minister from behind, placing a folder with the speech text on the podium. He whispered something into his ear, and as the minister nodded, the man looked directly at the camera, straight at Tokayev, whose heart was on the verge of attack. Those eyes, that unruly blonde curl. The Georgian, disguised in a suit, stood with the other officials at the far edge of the screen. When the camera panned back slightly, the scytheman also came into view, standing to the side, surrounded by a group of leather-clad motorcyclists shouting something. Flashbulbs burst, and the minister opened the folder and began to read.